There are ghosts that never bleed, but still haunt history women, whose lives were rewritten by the mouths of men who couldn't bear their own reflection. Anne of Cleves was one of them. The woman who crossed a frozen sea to marry a king, only to be branded ugly before the first kiss. In the winter of 1539, she stepped off a ship from Germany, 24 years old, pale from weeks of storms and sickness, believing she was walking into the fairy tale of queenship. Instead, she walked straight into a story of humiliation, danger, and survival, because the man waiting for her was not a prince in shining armor. He was Henry VIII, already 48, already rotting from the inside, already the executioner of 2 wives, and he was about to turn one woman's face into a national insult that would last for 500 years. Henry had buried 3 wives by the time Anne arrived. Catherine of Aragon, divorced and dying in exile. Anne Boleyn, beheaded by a French sword. And Jane Seymour, dead 12 days after giving birth to his long-awaited son. The King of England was sick, swollen, and paranoid. He needed a new marriage, not out of love, but out of politics. A Protestant alliance that might protect him from the Catholic powers of Europe. His minister, Thomas Cromwell. I found a candidate, Anne, daughter of the Duke of Cleves, quiet, pious, modest, and, according to reports, of middle beauty. Hans Holbein, the genius painter of the Tudor court, was sent to capture her likeness. The portrait he brought back showed a calm, dignified woman with clear skin and steady eyes, not a temptress, not a beauty, but respectable. Henry looked at that painting and fell in love with his own fantasy. He decided she would be the wife who would save his soul, restore his youth, and give him sons. He married the painting before he ever met the woman. When Anne finally reached England in the freezing days of December, the weather trapped her in Calais for weeks. Henry grew restless. On New Year's Day of 1540, unable to wait any longer, he decided to surprise his bride in disguise. As knights did in the old romances, he still adored. He burst into her chamber, dressed as a common traveller, expecting her to recognize the king beneath the cloak. But Anne, who had never seen him, who barely spoke English, saw only a sweating, limping stranger with a foul smell and a flushed face. She turned away politely, uninterested. The humiliation was instant and absolute. Henry, whose entire ego hung on the illusion of being irresistible, felt the sting of rejection more deeply than any sword. In that moment, he decided she was ugly. And once a king calls you ugly, you stay ugly for 5 centuries. The wedding went ahead because politics demanded it. On the 6th of January, the ceremony at Greenwich glittered with gold and wine and hollow joy. Anne wore a gown of silver and gold, her face serene, her manners perfect. Henry's lips brushed hers for less than a heartbeat. That night, they were placed in bed together under the eyes of the court. By morning, the king was spreading whispers that he could not perform his duty, that she repulsed him, that her body was slack and her smell unendurable. The truth was simpler. Henry's body had long since betrayed him. The leg ulcer that oozed blood and pus, the pain that kept him from sleep, the impotence that gnawed at his pride, all of it demanded a scapegoat. Anne became that scapegoat. She was the mirror that refused to flatter him, and for that she was condemned not to death, but to ridicule. While Henry complained of her ugliness, he was already courting her young maid, Catherine Howard, barely 19, full of laughter, flirtation, and danger. By the summer of 1540, he was desperate to be free of Anne, and desperate to destroy Cromwell, the minister who had arranged the match. Within months, both were gone. Cromwell beheaded on Tower Hill, his head hacked from his shoulders by a drunken executioner, and Anne dismissed from queenship with chilling politeness. But here, history takes a strange turn. For the first time, a wife of Henry VIII refused to fight back. She did not cry treason or appeal to Rome. She did not demand her rights as queen. When she was told the marriage would be annulled, she bowed her head and agreed. She called Henry her beloved brother, and in return, the king gave her palaces, lands, a vast income, and the most precious gift of all her life. From that moment on, Anne of Cleves became something almost mythic, the queen who survived. While Catherine Howard lost her head on the scaffold, Anne was playing cards by the fire at Richmond Palace. While Henry raged, remarried, and rotted, Anne decorated her halls, kept dogs and birds, and dined with the daughters of the women who had died before her. She wrote letters in graceful English, attended court as the king's sister, and smiled through every royal feast without ever crossing the line of danger. She saw through the illusion that had destroyed so many others that love or truth could protect a woman from a king. She understood the only way to live in the shadow of absolute power was to disappear into obedience, to survive quietly while the noise of the court devoured others. When Henry finally died in January of 1547, bloated and alone, Anne was still alive, still wealthy, still free. She attended the coronation of his son Edward, the brief reign of his daughter Mary, and lived long enough to see Elizabeth, the child of the executed Anne Boleyn, begin her rise. She changed her religion when it was wise to do so. Protestant under Edward, Catholic under Mary, never zealous, always careful. She lived in comfort until the summer of 1557. When illness finally took her at Chelsea Old Manor, she was buried at Westminster Abbey, not with the grandeur of queens who died dramatically, but with the quiet dignity of one who had mastered survival. Her tomb bears no effigy, only a simple stone, and her name, the plainest queen of all, and the one who won the game. Yet for centuries, her legacy was written in a single, cruel word: ugly. That was Henry's final revenge. The lie that buried her reputation deeper than any coffin. Historians repeated it like scripture. The wife he could not love became the woman unworthy of love. But look closer, and the truth gleams through the dust. Anne of Cleves was never ugly. She was brilliant. She read the rules of a world built to destroy her and learned how to survive it. Where others fought and burned, she bowed and lived. She traded pride for peace, vanity for longevity, a crown for freedom. In the bloody theatre of Tudor England, where almost every woman who touched the throne died on it, Anne walked away. The king called her ugly. But history, if it ever learns to look again, will call her wise. She was born in the year 1515 in Dusseldorf, in the quiet court of Cleves, where the air smelled of linen and candle wax, and piety was a daily rhythm rather than a performance. Her father, John III, was a cautious man, more politician than warrior, forever balancing between the Catholic emperor and the Protestant princes that divided Germany. Her mother, Maria of Jülichberg, was stern and devout, the kind of woman whose eyes could silence a room. Anne's childhood passed under their careful watch, behind heavy stone walls and tapestries, stitched with scenes of saints and harvests, where laughter was a luxury and obedience a duty. She learned her letters, her prayers, her embroidery, and her place. She would never be the center of her world, only a part of a larger plan drawn by men who would never consult her. The court of Cleves was a world without music or flirtation. There were no masks where courtiers wore golden masks and whispered sonnets behind fans. No feasts where the wine overflowed until dawn. It was a Protestant court plain, disciplined and sober. Anne learned to sew fine linen altar cloths, to manage servants, to prepare herbal remedies for colds and childbirth. She read the Bible in German and practiced the stillness of a woman expected to be useful but invisible. She did not learn to dance the galliard, did not learn to play the lute or sing, because such things were deemed worldly and vain. The most daring thing she ever held in her hands was a silver needle glinting in the firelight. Yet beneath that calm exterior, she was not without thought. She watched, she listened. She understood the power that moved quietly through her father's chambers, the letters, the envoys, the alliances being built not with swords, but with marriages. When she was still a girl, her father began seeking matches for her. But he was deliberate, too deliberate. One proposal after another fell apart in the swirl of politics. The Duke of Lorraine had once nearly been her husband, but the contract never reached a seal. Her older sister Sibylla had married the Elector of Saxony and brought prestige to their house, while Anne remained at home, neither bride nor nun, a pawn waiting to be moved. As the years passed, whispers crept through the court. 24 and unmarried was an uneasy age for a noblewoman. Some said she was too serious, others that she was too plain, or perhaps too pious to please a man of power. She ignored the talk, but she felt the weight of each passing season pressing against her chest like the cold stone walls of her home. When her father died and her brother William became Duke, her future was suddenly no longer in her family's hands, but in the hands of Europe's ambitions. In England, a king was looking for a wife, a man whose name was already blackened with blood and rumour, a man whose heart had been hollowed out by loss and ego. Henry VIII was searching for his fourth queen. His minister Thomas Cromwell wanted a German alliance to secure England against Catholic invasion, and Anne, with her modest manners and Protestant bloodline, became an answer to that question. Across Europe, portraits and letters flew like migrating birds. Holbein, the painter whose brush had already immortalized the power of the English crown, was sent to capture Anne's face. She stood before him shyly, wrapped in the heavy fabric of her homeland, her hands folded neatly in her lap. He painted her with a precision that was almost cruel in its honesty. The high forehead, the steady gaze, the quiet dignity of a woman who did not yet know her life was being rewritten in strokes of oil and pigment. When Henry saw the painting, he believed he saw salvation. He saw not a woman, but a cure for his loneliness and his fear. He imagined her soft-spoken gratitude, her obedience, her fertility. In his mind, she was the opposite of the wives who had wounded him no temper, no wit sharp enough to pierce his pride. He signed the marriage contract before a single word was exchanged, before the wind could even carry her name across the channel. And so Anne of Cleves, who had never danced, who had never sung for a man, who had never looked beyond the grey horizon of her small duchy, was told she would become Queen of England. Her journey began in the bitter winter of 1539. She left home wrapped in furs, her mother weeping quietly as the bells of Dusseldorf tolled behind her. The roads were frozen and cruel. Her carriage jolted over ruts and ice as she crossed the Rhineland toward the sea. Every stop brought new faces, new languages, and new fears. She wrote polite letters to her brother, thanking him for the honour, though in her heart she must have wondered whether she was being sent to her wedding or her execution. The winds turned violent as she reached the coast. She waited for weeks in Calais, trapped by storms, while England's impatient king sent letters demanding her arrival. When the sea finally calmed, she boarded a ship that pitched and rolled until her stomach emptied itself into buckets below deck. By the time she set foot in Kent on the 27th of December, She was white as wax and trembling. The English greeted her with fireworks, trumpets, and Latin speeches she could barely understand. They called her radiant, though her eyes were dull from exhaustion. She smiled because she knew that queens do not get to look afraid. At Rochester, she rested in the bishop's palace, surrounded by courtiers who spoke words she did not know. The air smelled of ale and roast meat, of foreign spices and perfume, strange and overwhelming. She spent her first night in England listening to the wind rattle the shutters and wondering what kind of man awaited her. She had heard the stories of Catherine of Aragon exiled and broken, of Anne Boleyn's head struck from her shoulders by a French sword, of Jane Seymour dead in childbirth. But she told herself she was different. She would be obedient. She would bring peace. When the door burst open on New Year's morning and a red-faced stranger limped into her chamber unannounced, she thought it a drunken servant. The man was enormous, sweating beneath his cloak, his breath heavy with wine. He seized her hand and kissed it, roughly, calling her sweet names she did not understand. Anne, startled, pulled back, murmured polite confusion, and turned toward the window to watch the bull baiting in the courtyard below. Her ladies froze in horror. The stranger was the king, and in that instant, her fate was sealed. Henry stormed out, humiliated, his pride torn apart by a woman who hadn't even known she'd insulted him. When he returned dressed in jewels and gold, she knelt, trembling, and greeted him with all the reverence she could summon. But it was too late. In the space of a single look, she had become a disappointment too great to forgive. The court whispered that the king was displeased, that he had said she was nothing so fair as reported. And when a king's desire cools, it turns quickly into cruelty. The wedding took place all the same, because alliances mattered more than affection. The palace glowed with candlelight and gold cloth, but behind every smile there was fear. Henry kissed his bride with lips colder than steel. That night, they were put to bed in ceremony and silence. Emily still, her heart pounding, her mind blank with terror. In the morning, Henry declared that he could not bring himself to touch her. He told his counselors she had evil smells about her body. It was a lie, but it became a weapon. The courtiers repeated it, the ambassadors recorded it, and the world believed it. And so the girl who had spent her childhood learning humility found herself punished for it. Her modesty, true gentleness, her ignorance of English courtly games became the noose that nearly closed around her neck. Yet even then, even in the center of that storm of shame, she began to understand the truth of her situation, that her survival would depend not on beauty, not on charm, but on silence. She had entered a world ruled by a man who confused humiliation with justice, and she would have to learn to bow without breaking. It was not yet clear that she would become the only one who ever did. The days after her wedding moved like fog, silent, thick, suffocating. Anne awoke each morning in a golden prison. The Queen of England in name, but not in spirit. She ate alone, prayed alone, and sat through endless ceremonies that blurred together, her German tongue tripping over the soft vowels of a foreign language. The courtiers watched her with careful eyes, gauging her every gesture for signs of approval or doom. They whispered that the king could not bear to touch her, that the marriage had not been consummated, that her place upon the throne was already beginning to crack beneath her. And yet, every morning, she put on her jewels, lifted her chin, and walked into the royal chambers as if she still believed she belonged there. Henry avoided her more and more, spending long hours in his private rooms, his leg ulcer bleeding through his bandages, his temper festering in pain and humiliation. He told his council that he had been deceived, that she was nothing like the portrait he had seen. He mocked her accent, her clothes, the way she curtsied too deeply or not enough, as though every breath she took was an insult to him. But the truth was more pitiful than cruel. Henry was aging, dying in small, secret ways, his virility gone, his body bloated, his reflection unbearable. He needed someone to carry his shame for him, and Anne became that vessel. She was the mirror he could not bear to look into, the living proof that the once golden Prince of England had turned into a monster of flesh and vanity. The court, as always, followed his mood. Those who had once praised Anne's grace now called her dull. The same nobles who had bowed to her throne began to turn their faces away when she passed. Yet there was one man whose reputation was falling faster than hers, Thomas Cromwell. The man who had arranged the marriage, who had painted the alliance as Henry's greatest triumph, was now watching the king's favour crumble, like dust between his fingers. Cromwell had been too clever, too powerful, too indispensable for too long. And in Henry's court, that was a death sentence waiting for the right excuse. The Cleves marriage had provided it. While Henry's anger grew, another figure entered the story like a spark in dry grass. Catherine Howard Young, radiant, and everything Anne was not. She was a girl barely grown into womanhood, the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, and she danced through the court with laughter that made even the king forget the ache in his bones. She flirted with the abandon of youth. And Henry, who longed to believe himself still desirable, mistook her playfulness for passion. Soon the court began to buzz with the kind of gossip that never stayed secret. The king's eyes followed Catherine everywhere, and Anne, watching from her gilded distance, I must have known that the end was already being written. In the spring of 1540, the whispers reached her chambers, rumours that the king was seeking counsel from the archbishop, that the question of her marriage's legitimacy had been raised. Anne did not protest. She did not rage. She simply grew still, like a deer sensing the approach of hunters. When envoys arrived from the Privy Council, she received them with perfect composure. They spoke to her in slow, careful English, explaining that questions had arisen about the pre-contract she had once been promised to the Duke of Lorraine's son. The marriage, they suggested, might not be valid. The king was troubled. It would be wise to cooperate. She listened, nodded, asked for time to pray, and dismissed them with a smile so calm it chilled even her enemies. That night, she did pray, not for her crown, but for clarity. She had seen the pattern of Henry's wives, the proud ones who argued, the devout ones who defied, the passionate ones who tried to love him, and she had seen where those choices led. She knew that defiance in England was written in blood. She knew that the Tower stood waiting, its black stones echoing with the ghosts of queens who had not known when to yield. And so, Anne made a decision that few women in history have had the clarity or courage to make. She would not fight the king. She would surrender before he could destroy her. The next morning, she sent word to the council that she would agree to whatever the king deemed necessary. She claimed no right to the title of queen, no claim to his bed or his name. She signed her consent with a steady hand, calling Henry her most dear and gracious brother, a phrase that turned mockery into survival. It was the sound of a woman outsmarting death itself. Henry, caught off guard by her submission, softened. The fury that had once burned in him cooled into relief. He called her good, gentle, wise. He promised to care for her as though she were family. And for once, he kept his word. Within days, Anne was no longer Queen of England. Yet she had never been more powerful. She was granted palaces fit for royalty, Richmond and Hever, the same estate where Anne Boleyn had once lived as a girl. She received an income so vast that even the highest nobles envied her. Servants filled her halls, and carriages waited at her command. Henry declared that she would be treated as the king's beloved sister, giving her rank above every woman in England except his daughters. She no longer had to share a bed with a man who terrified her, no longer had to wear the crown that could turn to an executioner's hood overnight. She had chosen peace, and peace had rewarded her. When the news reached her homeland, her brother, Duke William, was furious. He accused her of shaming their family, of submitting too easily. But Anne understood something her brother never could. Power in England was a game of survival, not pride. She wrote back that she was content, that the king had treated her with honor, that her conscience was clear, and perhaps, beneath those polite words, there was a small, private smile. She had been married to one of the most dangerous men in Europe, and lived to tell the tale. That was more than any of his other wives could claim. Months later, she watched from her estate as the bells of London rang for Henry's marriage to Catherine Howard. The same courtiers who had once served her now cheered for the new bride. The same jewels she had worn gleamed on another woman's neck. Yet Anne felt no envy, no bitterness, only the strange satisfaction of distance. She knew what waited for the girl who had replaced her. She knew the shape of Henry's love, a hunger that devoured everything it touched. Catherine danced, laughed, and glowed in her youth. But every time Anne heard of the king's joy, she felt a chill. She knew it could not last. In her quiet palace at Richmond, she filled her days with small joys that were entirely her own. She kept little dogs that followed her everywhere, soft bundles of fur that slept on her lap while she played cards with her ladies. She learned to speak English fluently, her accent still marked but graceful. She hosted dinners with music and laughter, something she had never known in Cleves. Courtiers came to visit her. Drawn by her warmth and generosity, she gave alms to the poor and gifts to the servants who had remained loyal. She lived well, but more than that, she lived free. When word came that Catherine Howard had been arrested for adultery, the court held its breath. Anne did not. She simply set down her cards, stroked her dog's head, and whispered a prayer. When she later watched the young queen's execution from the crowd at Tower Green, she did not cry. The girl who had stolen her crown had paid with her head. The man who had once called Anne ugly was older, slower, sicker, and lonelier than ever. She had lost a title but gained a lifetime. The world might never understand the wisdom in that trade, but Anne did. She understood that in the long war between pride and survival, only those who learned to bow would live to rise again. And so she remained, quietly reigning in her own small kingdom of calm. While kings and queens burned out around her, the years after Catherine Howard's death unfolded like a long exhale of relief for Anne, who had finally mastered the art of being visible without drawing danger. England moved forward through its endless tides of weddings and funerals, but she had already slipped into a calmer current, one far from the noise of ambition. She rose late, walked in her gardens lined with English roses, and sometimes stood for hours beside the river, her gaze lost in the rippling silver surface that reflected a life that no one had ever truly seen. The courtiers who visited her estates were surprised by her serenity, by the quiet intelligence that revealed itself not through words, but through the patience with which she listened. She spoke English now almost fluently, her accent still lilting with the softness of the Rhine, and her laughter rare. But genuine was said to warm even the most jaded hearts at court. Yet even in her contentment, she knew better than to forget where she was. England was not a country that forgave mistakes. A smile could save a life. A wrong word could end it. She visited the royal court occasionally, dressed in gowns that were modest but richly woven, jewels glittering on her neck that once belonged to queens who had died wearing them. The courtiers called her Madame the King's sister, a title that gave her rank and dignity, but no threat to the throne. She curtsied to Henry each time they met, and he would lift her up with paternal affection, sometimes even embracing her publicly, a gesture that served him more than her. To the watching world, it showed his mercy, his magnanimity, his control. To Anne, it was simply the final act of the play she had agreed to perform for survival. She smiled. She bowed. She played the part with perfect grace. It was a dangerous kind of invisibility, one that came not from being unseen, but from being harmless. As the years rolled forward, Henry's health worsened. His leg, the one that had been torn open in that long-ago jousting accident, rotted so badly that courtiers learned to step back when he entered the room. Unable to stand the stench, his moods grew more unpredictable. His laughter was followed by rages, and his prayers by threats. Yet in his darkest moods, he never spoke ill of Anne. She had become, in his memory, a peaceful ghost, a woman who had neither challenged nor deceived him. And in that fragile, dangerous kingdom, to be forgotten was the surest form of safety. In 1543, the king married again Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife. A woman as cautious as she was clever, Anne attended the wedding. Her presence, a kind of living reminder of both Henry's power and his mercy. The palace glittered, as it always did on such occasions. Though the air was heavy with unspoken warnings, everyone knew how the story usually ended. Yet Catherine Parr, like Anne, understood the secret rhythm of survival. She did not flatter too much, nor did she contradict the king's wishes. She tended to his leg, soothed his tempers, read scripture with him in the evenings when his pain became unbearable. She lived quietly, calculatingly, never stepping beyond the invisible line that separated affection from threat. Anne saw herself in this new queen, the restraint, the quiet intelligence, the subtle art of staying alive in a house where love was a weapon sharper than any sword. They spoke sometimes in private, two women who had shared a marriage with the same man, exchanging words that hovered between confession and strategy. Catherine asked once if Anne ever regretted giving up her crown. Anne smiled faintly and answered that she had never slept more peacefully than she had after losing it. She told her that there were two kinds of queens, those who died to keep their titles, and those who lived because they gave them up. Catherine never forgot those words. When Henry's final illness began to eat through him, Anne was living at Hever, surrounded by her dogs, und her gardens, and the quiet hum of servants who adored her. The news came one grey January morning of 1547. The king was dead. The messenger who brought it knelt before her, waiting for some visible sign of grief. But Anne only bowed her head. The man who had nearly destroyed her was gone, and she was free in a way she had never truly been before. She was 31 years old, wealthy, independent, beholden to no husband, no court, no priest. The bells that rang for Henry's funeral echoed across the country like thunder rolling away from a storm that had finally spent itself. In London, Edward, the boy who had cost Jane Seymour her life, was crowned king. Anne attended the coronation in February, standing among the nobles in a gown of pale silver, her hair veiled with pearls. Those who saw her whispered that she looked like a spirit from another world, serene and untouchable. She smiled for the boy king, bowed deeply, and returned to her estates. She had learned not to linger near the thrones of men who wore crowns that could become execution blocks overnight. Under Edward's rule, England shifted again, more Protestant, more rigid, more certain that it was the chosen nation of God. Anne, born a Protestant herself, adapted easily. She read scripture in English now, though her prayers were softer, more private than public. She understood that faith in England was not just belief, it was allegiance, and allegiance was currency. When she wrote to Edward's council, her letters were measured and wise, filled with gentle loyalty but no flattery. They granted her every request she made. The years passed, the tides of religion turning like the weather. And then came Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, once cast aside and called a bastard, now sat on the throne as Queen of England. The court changed overnight. Priests returned. Latin Mass filled the air again, and the fires of the heresy trials began to burn. But Anne, as always, understood the game before it was even named. She returned to the Catholic rituals she had known in childhood, confessed her sins, attended Mass, and hung a crucifix above her bed. It was not belief that moved her, it was instinct. She had survived Henry's love. She would not die for his daughter's faith. Mary, surprisingly, treated her with kindness. The two women had known each other in gentler days, and Mary never forgot that Anne had shown her respect when others had turned away. They played cards together on winter evenings at Whitehall, their laughter echoing softly beneath the painted ceilings, while the fires outside devoured the heretics of the realm. Sometimes, when Mary's temper flared or her sickness grew worse, Anne would quietly lay a hand over hers and murmur something in her soft German accent that made the Queen smile again. She had become what few women in that kingdom ever managed to be, a figure of comfort rather than competition. In her estates, she lived surrounded by peace, by music, by the low murmur of contentment that comes when a life once built on fear has finally found its stillness. She wrote letters to Elizabeth, the fiery daughter of Anne Boleyn, who was then living in cautious isolation. Elizabeth admired her deeply, calling her a lady most wise and gracious. In Anne's company, she saw what survival looked like, not surrender, not weakness, but the kind of quiet strength that endures when the fire has gone out. By the time the first signs of illness crept into her body, Anne had lived more freely than any of Henry's wives could have imagined. She had seen queens crowned and queens beheaded, had watched the tides of faith rise and fall like the moon, and through it all she had never once raised her voice. She had outlasted them all, not through defiance, but through the art of yielding at precisely the right moment, and though history would later call her plain, she had been beautiful in the way that wisdom is beautiful, unshakable, unshowy, and quietly eternal. As the candles burned low each night, she would sit by her window and look toward the direction of London, where the towers of Westminster glimmered faintly through the mist. Somewhere within those walls lay the bones of the man who had called her ugly, and she would smile softly, not in mockery but in peace, for she had outlived him, outlived his rage, outlived the lie he had made of her. And as the wind moved across the gardens and rustled the roses she had planted years before, she might have thought, not of the crown she had lost, but of the quiet life she had gained, the life that, against all odds, had been entirely her own. The final years of Anne's life unfolded like the slow descent of twilight over a calm sea, beautiful and fading at once. By then she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of peace, mornings filled with sunlight slipping through lattice windows, afternoons spent walking among orchards, heavy with fruit, evenings when music drifted softly from her hall, while the world beyond her gates burned with wars of faith and power. She no longer feared the rumours of court or the shifting loyalties of kings and queens. England had become a land of ghosts to her, a place she had learned to inhabit without belonging to it. And perhaps that was her secret strength. She had never tried to rule it, She had only learned how to live within its storms until the skies cleared. Her hair, once the pale gold of wheat, had turned to silver by the time Mary's reign began to falter under the weight of illness and unrest. The queen who had burned for faith was now burning herself out, her body devoured by fever and sorrow. Anne saw her only rarely in those last months, but she sent gentle letters, written in her precise hand, offering prayers and affection. There was a quiet tenderness between them. Two women who had outlasted the tempests of a man who had shaped their fates before either had the power to resist him. Mary had been the daughter of the wife Henry cast aside. Anne, the wife, he had cast aside himself. And in that mirrored suffering, they had found something like sisterhood. When Mary's messengers came to Chelsea bearing gifts, fine cloth, sweet wine, silver rosaries, Anne accepted them with gratitude. Though her body was already failing, her illness began as a dull ache beneath her ribs, a heaviness that the physicians called a corruption of the liver. They bled her. They prayed over her. They fed her broths, laced with herbs. And none of it mattered. The pain grew, slow and constant. Like the pull of the tide, she moved less, spoke less, and yet her composure never cracked. Those who attended her said she was unfailingly kind, even when pain twisted her voice to whispers. She spent long hours by the window of her chamber. Her dogs curled at her feet, watching the river glimmer beneath the sun. She knew she was dying, but she faced it the same way she had faced everything else, with quiet acceptance and a strange, unflinching dignity that made others forget she had ever been called plain. In the spring of 1557, she summoned her confessor and dictated her will. It was not a queen's testament, but a woman's farewell, tender and deliberate. Every servant was remembered, from the chamberlain who had managed her estates to the kitchen, boys who had run errands through the halls. She left gowns to her ladies, rings to her friends, small silver icons to the priests who had served her, and generous coins to the poor of the surrounding villages. She gave to Queen Mary a necklace of rubies and pearls that had once been a gift from Henry, perhaps as a way of closing the circle of their shared story. To Elizabeth she sent a pendant and several rings, a gesture of affection to the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose shadow had hung over both of them all their lives. To her household she left her blessing, written in her own hand, ending with the words, "Be kind to one another, and remember that peace is a crown none can take." The night she finished her will, the candlelight danced across her face, illuminating the faint lines that time had etched around her eyes. Her physician begged her to rest, but she only smiled. "I have rested long enough," she murmured. She spoke then of Germany, of the fields of Cleves, where she had once walked as a girl, of the smell of rain against the Rhine, of her mother's voice reading scripture in the evenings. She had not spoken of home in years, perhaps fearing that memory might loosen the fragile roots she had built in England. But now, near the end, her voice softened, as if she had been waiting for this release, for the right to remember herself before the crown, before the voyage, before the king. By summer, she could no longer leave her bed. The palace grew quiet except for the rustle of servants moving carefully through the corridors and the faint sound of her dogs whining outside her door. On July the 16th, as the morning sun broke through the mist over the Thames, she asked for the curtains to be drawn back so that she might see the light one last time. The priest came to her bedside, the air thick with incense, and murmured Latin. She confessed her sins in a whisper, received the sacrament, and folded her hands upon the linen sheets. "God has been merciful," she said softly, though her voice trembled. Those were her last words. As the bells of Chelsea tolled the hour, Anne of Cleves slipped quietly from a world that had never understood her. leaving behind the only kind of legacy she had ever wanted: a life survived on her own terms. News of her death reached Queen Mary within hours, and the Queen ordered that Anne be buried with honours befitting her rank. It was a gesture of respect that few expected, but Mary was nothing if not loyal to the memory of those who had shown her kindness when kindness was rare. The funeral was arranged for early August, a full Catholic ceremony in Westminster Abbey, the same sacred place where kings and queens were crowned and buried. It was the kind of grandeur Anne herself would never have requested. But Mary insisted. On the morning of August the 4th, her coffin, draped in black velvet and marked with her coat of arms, was carried slowly through the streets of London. Bells rang in every church as the procession passed, their echoes rolling like thunder over the river. People crowded along the cobblestones to watch, bowing their heads as the cortege moved by a strange moment of reverence for a woman most of them had never met, and few had ever truly understood. Inside Westminster Abbey, candles blazed against the grey stone, their smoke rising in curling ribbons that reached the vaulted ceiling. The choir sang the Missa Pro Defunctis, their voices echoing through the sacred air like the sigh of angels. The coffin was lowered into the south aisle near the high altar, beneath the worn marble floor where generations of nobles slept. She was placed beside no husband, not child, no family, only herself. On the simple stone above her grave, they carved her name and title, Anne of Cleves, late Queen of England. No effigie, no portrait, no crown of stone, only words and the silence she had carried all her life. And yet, in that simplicity, there was something eternal. Unlike the other wives, whose stories had ended in flames or blood, Anne's story ended in peace. She had not been remembered as a martyr or a lover, not as a saint or a sinner, but as a survivor. Historians would later reduce her to the insult of a single man, forgetting that she had played the most dangerous game of all, and won. But perhaps that was as she intended. Perhaps she had known that history would overlook her, and perhaps she preferred it that way. To be forgotten, after all, was safer than to be remembered falsely. As the last prayers were spoken, the abbey fell silent, and somewhere beyond its thick stone walls, the evening light touched the river she had so often watched from her window. The water moved with the same calm certainty that had carried her through her life, a steady, patient current that outlasted every storm. Anne of Cleves had crossed that water once, terrified and alone. A stranger stepping into a kingdom ruled by a tyrant. Now she crossed it again, quietly, finally free of names and crowns. Her story ending not in fire or fear, but in the soft peace of endurance. And though the centuries would forget her face, her calm strength lingered, invisible but unbroken, like the echo of the tide against the stones of Westminster, whispering that survival, too, can be a kind of victory. For centuries after her death, Anne of Cleves lingered in silence, buried not only beneath the marble floors of Westminster Abbey, but beneath the weight of a lie that had been too convenient to question. Her tomb was simple, her name carved plainly in stone, her story sealed in a few careless lines written by men who preferred the drama of execution to the quiet power of survival. They called her the Flanders Mare, repeated the insult, like scripture, as though ugliness were the only history worth remembering. The lie hardened over generations until it became truth by repetition. And Anne, who had lived with more grace and wisdom than almost anyone around her, faded into the footnotes of a cruel king's reign. But the air in Westminster never forgets the sound of prayers. And if you walk the southern aisle in silence, you can almost feel her presence there, a stillness among the echoes, the quiet breath of a woman who outlived the storm that had tried to consume her. After her death, her possessions were scattered across England like the last pages of a book, No one bothered to finish reading. The jewels she had left to Mary and Elizabeth disappeared into royal inventories. Her gowns were passed down through the households of noblewomen until they fell apart with age. Her books, her letters, her embroidery gone. All of it swallowed by time. What remained was a name twisted by gossip and a story trimmed down to a single cruel joke. The chroniclers of Henry's reign preferred the wives who bled. Anne Boleyn's fall was a spectacle. Catherine Howard's youth made her tragedy irresistible. Jane Seymour had died, giving the king his longed-for son. Anne of Cleves, who had simply lived, did not satisfy the hunger of history. Survival, after all, does not make good theatre. But perhaps that was her final victory, to be forgotten on her own terms, to slip quietly out of the reach of men who would have rewritten her life again and again. For a woman in Tudor England, being erased could be a mercy. The world remembered the ones who had been destroyed, who had screamed or pleaded or burned, and the men who had destroyed them wore those memories like trophies. Anne gave them nothing. She left no scandal to gossip over, no confession to twist into a sermon, no corpse for poets to romanticize. She gave the world the gift of silence, and within that silence lay her defiance. Still, the centuries carried her name forward like a whisper through the dust. In the painted galleries of historians, her image was softened, reshaped, reconsidered. Scholars began to look again at the documents, the letters, the records of her settlement, the tone of her correspondence, the testimony of those who had actually known her. They found not a dull or witless woman, but one described by ambassadors as gracious, dignified, and steadfast. They found her household accounts showing generosity to her servants, her careful management of her estates, her unwavering diplomacy through the dangerous reigns that followed. Slowly, the image of the ugly wife began to crack. Beneath it, the truth shimmered like something long buried but still alive. She had been intelligent, she had been kind, she had been patient, strategic, cautious, and most of all brave. Not the kind of bravery that shouts in the face of death, but the quieter, harder kind that learns to survive in the shadow of power. She had known exactly how fragile her safety was, how easily a smile could be misread, how swiftly a king's favor could turn to hatred, and yet she had navigated that court with a grace that bordered on genius. When faced with humiliation, she had not defended herself with pride, she had defended herself with surrender. It was not weakness, it was warfare of a different kind. She had turned compliance into armor, humility into survival, silence into power. The story of Anne of Cleves is, at its heart, the story of how a woman defeated a tyrant not with a sword or a crown, but with composure. She had looked into the eyes of Henry VIII, a man who had broken kingdoms for love, a man who had executed women for failing to love him back, and she had given him what none of the others ever could, his illusion of control. She gave him the permission to save face, to end their marriage without blood, to call her sister instead of traitor. In doing so, she saved herself. It was an act of brilliance so subtle that history mistook it for passivity. But there is nothing passive about survival when the world is built to destroy you. And perhaps that is why her story still resonates. Even now, because every generation has its Henry's men who confuse power with love, who call women ugly or difficult when they refuse to perform the parts written for them. And every generation has its Anne's women who learn the art of endurance, who bend so they do not break, who understand that sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to step quietly away from the board. Anne of Cleves lived through an age that worshipped beauty, obedience, and death in equal measure, and she emerged, not beautiful to their eyes, not obedient in the way they demanded, and not dead. That is no small thing. If there was any tragedy in her story, it was not her rejection, but her erasure, the centuries of silence that followed, the endless repetition of a king's insult that drowned out her own voice. It is telling, perhaps, that the one woman who survived Henry's wrath is the one we remember least. History, it seems, prefers its women destroyed, but in the long shadow of that truth, Anne's life stands as quiet rebellion. She lived long enough to see kings die, long enough to bury her fear, long enough to build a life from the ruins of humiliation. Her calm endurance was a different kind of courage, one that left no monument, only the echo of peace. And yet, if one listens closely to the old stones of Westminster Abbey, if one stands where the air hums with centuries of prayer, there is something in that silence that feels like gratitude. Perhaps it is hers, or perhaps it is ours, the gratitude of those who came after, who finally learned that survival itself can be sacred. In her stillness, in her refusal to rage, she taught a truth larger than any crown that dignity is not given. It is chosen, and that a quiet life lived freely can outweigh 1,000 glittering deaths. The world has always wanted its heroines to burn brightly, to die beautifully, to be remembered for the way they fell. But Anne of Cleves refused to burn. She chose instead to endure, to breathe, to wait, to grow older in peace, to leave behind not ashes, but the faint, unshakable scent of resilience. In a history written by men obsessed with conquest, she offered a lesson. They could never understand that power can be survived, and that survival, in the end, is its own form of victory. So her name remains there, carved in stone and shadow, waiting for anyone who still cares to kneel and trace the letters with a hand. The marble is cold, the inscription fading, but beneath it lies the memory of a woman who played the impossible game of kings and walked away alive. And maybe that is the ending she wanted, not a legend carved in gold, but a whisper that never quite disappears. For centuries, she was the forgotten queen, the ugly wife, the one dismissed and erased. But history, patient and restless, always circles back to the truth. And when it does, it will find her again, the woman who was never a tragedy, only a triumph hidden in plain sight. The story of Anne of Cleves does not end where her tomb lies, nor does it rest in the yellowed pages of chronicles written by men who never understood her. It lingers, alive and quiet, in the invisible spaces where history forgets to look, in the rooms she once walked through, in the small acts of gentleness she left behind, in the steady rhythm of her patience that outlasted the centuries built to erase her. It is easy to imagine her spirit walking through Westminster Abbey at night, when the world sleeps and the candles burn low, moving past the marble kings and jeweled effigies toward the shadowed corner where her name is carved into stone. There is no crown above her head, no sword by her side, only silence. But it is a silence that speaks louder than all the royal noise around her. She does not haunt the world in bitterness, she lingers in peace, as if reminding us that survival, when done with grace, can be the purest form of defiance. For what was her life, if not an act of defiance wrapped in humility? In a time when women were treated as alliances, as wombs, as symbols, she turned the game on its head without ever raising her voice. She was supposed to fail, supposed to be the forgotten queen whose worth ended the moment she ceased to please a man, but she lived instead as though the title had never mattered. Her power was not in beauty, nor in ambition, nor in the favor of courtiers. It was in the quiet conviction that peace could be chosen, even in a world built for chaos. She refused to let Henry's lie define her. She refused to live in fear of what others saw when they looked at her. She built her own kind of kingdom, one made not of conquest, but of contentment, not of thrones, but of small. Human joy is a game of cards, by firelight, a walk through a garden heavy with roses, the laughter of her servants, the stillness of an evening unbroken by orders or cruelty. When one looks back through the lens of centuries, it is tempting to see her as a shadow among brighter flames. Anne Boleyn burned like a comet. Catherine Howard flared like a candle snuffed too soon. Jane Seymour flickered and died in the hour of triumph. And Catherine of Aragon glowed with a martyr's devotion. But Anne of Cleves was the moonlight after the fire, cool and steady, lighting a gentler path through the ruins of Henry's court. She is the proof that there was another way to survive power without being consumed by it. History, obsessed with drama, rarely celebrates restraint. But the strength required to endure in silence is far greater than the strength required to fight and fall. It is curious how, even in our age, century later, the word ugly still clings to her like smoke. It tells us less about her face than it does about the eyes that judged it. Henry's court was a theatre of illusions, a place where beauty was measured by obedience and charm by flattery. A woman who did not flirt was dull. A woman who did not yield was difficult. A woman who did not bend beneath the king's desires was unworthy. The insult that destroyed Anne's reputation was never about her looks, it was about her refusal to perform. When she did not react to Henry's disguise, she shattered his fantasy of himself. And in his rage, he punished her by branding her with ugliness. That word, repeated over centuries, became her invisible cage. Yet if one looks closely at her portraits, at Holbein's meticulous brushwork, at the serenity in her eyes, it becomes clear that the only ugliness in her story belonged to the man who could not bear to see a woman unmoved by his power. There is something profoundly modern about Anne's story, something that stretches far beyond the cold halls of Tudor England. Her life is not just a tale of one woman surviving a dangerous marriage. It is a mirror that reflects every age where women have been measured by their compliance, every era that punishes silence less than disobedience, every generation that turns a woman's calm into a weapon against her. Anne was not extraordinary because she was born noble or because she married a king. She was extraordinary because she refused to let humiliation consume her. She taught herself to breathe underwater, in a sea that had drowned stronger souls. And she emerged from it, not triumphant in the worldly sense, but whole. Her legacy is not carved in marble, but whispered in the quiet corners of history, in the lives of those who have learned to endure with dignity. Each time a woman walks away from cruelty instead of fighting to prove her worth, Anne's spirit walks with her. Each time someone chooses peace over pride, grace over bitterness, or silence over destruction, her lesson breathes again. She understood something that her world could not comprehend, that to live gently in a brutal age is its own rebellion. And though centuries have passed since she last drew breath, her calm endurance remains a kind of protest against the noise that once tried to define her. If one imagines her now, centuries after the last bell of her funeral faded into the London fog, she would not be angry. She would not demand that her name be cleared or her beauty restored in the minds of scholars. She would only smile, as she had done her whole life, with that same unshakable serenity. Because what is beauty but the art of peace written on a person's face? And what is victory but the simple act of surviving a story meant to destroy you? Henry's England has long since rotted away. Its palaces turned to stone and shadow. Its crown passed from one trembling hand to another. But Anne endures unbothered by the lies, untouched by time. I remembered not as the queen who failed to please a king, But as the woman who quietly mastered the one thing none of her rivals could, the ability to live freely in a cage and still remain whole, her tomb may be modest, her story misremembered. But there is a strange poetry in that too. She had no need for statues or songs. Her victory was too subtle for such noise. She became what all the others could not, a survivor who owed nothing to anyone, a woman whose silence humiliated a king more deeply than any defiance could. In the end, it was not Henry who conquered her, it was she who outlasted him, who lived long enough to watch his name sink into the muck of his own cruelty. Time has stripped away his power, his glory, his empire, leaving behind only the faint odor of his decay. But time has been gentle with Anne. Her story, once a whisper, has begun to rise again, not in anger, but in quiet truth. And maybe that is how history heals itself, not through shouting, not through vengeance, but through rediscovery, through finding the strength that was overlooked, the kindness that was mocked, the wisdom that was dismissed. Somewhere beneath the layers of dust and judgment, Anne of Cleves waits for the world to see her, as she truly was a woman who understood the strange alchemy of survival, who turned humiliation into freedom, who outwitted one of the most dangerous men ever to sit on a throne by simply choosing not to play his game. In that choice lies the power that no king could touch, and in that quiet endurance lies her immortality. Century later, when visitors wander through Westminster Abbey with their maps and murmured tours, a few pause over the slab of pale stone that bears the faint letters of her name. It lies there without grandeur, half hidden between the altars and the resting places of kings. And yet beneath that unassuming marble lies one of the most extraordinary lives of the Tudor age. Most walk past her without a thought, chasing the grander tombs, the gilded monuments, the names carved deep into history. But if they stopped, if they let the silence settle, they might feel it, the quiet pulse of endurance still echoing beneath their feet, the soft defiance of a woman who refused to let power break her. Anne of Cleves has no effigy, no elaborate carvings of angels or crowns, but she has something rarer peace, and that, in a world that celebrated violence as virtue, may be the greatest monument of all. The centuries have been unkind to her, in the way that silence often is. Historians for generations preferred stories that bled. They filled libraries with tales of Anne Boleyn's ambition and Catherine Howard's folly, with the doomed grace of Catherine of Aragon and the saintly obedience of Jane Seymour. They loved passion and death, because those things were loud. But Anne of Cleves' story was quiet, and quiet stories are easy to misplace. Her portrait hung in dusty corridors, her name reduced to the cruel nickname whispered by a king whose pride could not bear rejection. The irony, of course, is that it was Henry, not Anne, who was the true tragedy. His kingdom, his marriages, his endless need to be adored had consumed him long before his body gave out. Yet it was Anne, the woman he discarded, who found what he never could: contentment. She lived in peace, and peace was the one thing Henry's crown could never buy. When scholars at last returned to her life, they began to uncover the traces she had left behind, the letters written in her careful hand, the household accounts that revealed her discipline and generosity, the reports of diplomats who had described her as modest, pleasant, and wise. They saw her not as the fool Henry painted her to be, but as a woman of composure and courage, navigating a foreign land where every word could mean survival or ruin. They found, too, that she had learned to move between faiths with a grace that confounded the rigid expectations of her time. Protestant by birth, Catholic by necessity, she bent with the tide of England's politics and emerged unbroken. Some called it compromise, others cowardice, But those who truly understood her saw it for what it was: wisdom. She had witnessed how conviction became a noose in the wrong hands, and she had chosen life instead. In doing so, she became something rare and almost radical, a woman who owned herself, even in her stillness. She had influence. The young Elizabeth, wary and brilliant, learned something from watching her. From Anne's measured patience, Elizabeth saw the art of surviving men's expectations, of smiling without yielding, of wielding power through calm rather than fury. It is no coincidence that when Elizabeth grew into her crown, she ruled with a mastery of restraint that mirrored Anne's own. Where others raged, Elizabeth waited. Where others begged, she calculated. Where others fell to pride, she listened. The echo of Anne of Cleves can be felt in the composure of England's greatest queen. History may not connect them directly, but wisdom often passes in silence. Not through books or proclamations, but through the quiet example of those who lived before. Anne's story reminds us that not every battle worth winning happens on a field or a scaffold. Some wars are fought in whispers, in patience, in the long discipline of staying alive when the world wants you gone. She fought hers not with defiance, but with grace. Not by shouting, but by enduring. Every time she curtsied instead of crying out. Every time she smiled when others would have screamed. She was performing an act of rebellion too subtle for her enemies to recognize. She turned survival into a form of artistry, and in doing so, she exposed the great illusion of Henry's power, that even the most ruthless king cannot control a soul that refuses to hate. It is almost poetic that the very insult meant to destroy her ugly has become meaningless with time. The word no longer holds any shape in the face of her endurance. What, after all, is beauty measured against survival? The portraits of queens once adored have faded. Their jewels rest in museums. Their names remembered mostly for how they died. Anne's beauty was not in her features, but in her refusal to vanish. When everything else was lost to time, a key dignity endured. That is a beauty unbreakable, the kind that outlasts kingdoms. And still, there are nights when the abbey grows cold and the light from the chandeliers flickers over the tombs, when it feels as if she stirs beneath the stone, her spirit walking the aisles that once echoed with prayers for her soul. You can almost imagine her hands folded, her eyes calm, her mouth curved in that slight, knowing smile. She does not seek vengeance. She does not weep for what was taken from her. She has no need to. She has already won the only victory that ever mattered. She lived well. She died peacefully. And she was never conquered. Around her lie the kings and warriors who fought to the end, whose bones rest in ornate coffins, whose names are carved deeper than hers. And yet their victories turn to dust, while hers remains small. Invisible, but éternel. Every woman who has ever endured humiliation and chosen dignity, every person who has ever been underestimated and yet refused to break, carries a spark of her story within them. She is a reminder that history does not belong only to the loud or the violent, but also to those who endure quietly until the noise burns itself out. There is strength in gentleness, power in patience, victory in restraint. Anne of Cleves taught that lesson 500 years ago without ever meaning to, simply by being herself, simply by living. Perhaps that is why her name, though faint, still remains carved in stone, because the truth always finds its way back, even when buried beneath centuries of lies. Her story continues not in the gilded pages of kings, but in the quiet recognition of those who see her for what she was, the survivor who outwitted a tyrant, the queen who refused to play the martyr, the woman who made peace her rebellion. Time has finally caught up to her, and in doing so, it has restored her crown. not the jeweled circlet she once wore for a single doomed marriage, but the invisible one she earned through grace, endurance, and the kind of strength that cannot be destroyed. If she could speak now, standing in the flickering candlelight of her own forgotten tomb, she would say nothing boastful. She would only whisper what she once lived by, that peace is not weakness, that silence is not surrender, and that survival, when it demands every ounce of patience a heart can bear, is its own form of glory. Then she would vanish again into the stillness, leaving only the faint warmth of her lesson behind. And as the centuries turn, as kings rise and fall, and history is rewritten once more, that warmth will remain the quiet pulse of a woman who refused to die on anyone else's terms, whose grace outlasted an empire, whose story proves that sometimes the softest voices echo the longest. Time, as always, carried on without mercy, burying the noise of one generation beneath the whispers of the next. And yet Anne of Cleves remained an echo that refused to fade. She was no longer just the queen who had been called ugly, nor the footnote in a tyrant's love story. She had become something larger, a symbol of the quiet rebellion that survives in every age. The story of her life, once dismissed as uneventful, began to shift like dust stirred by light. The world, centuries later, was finally learning to listen to the silences it had ignored. Her portrait, painted by Holbein, was no longer examined for its lack of charm or its supposed deceit, but for what it truly captured: the face of a woman who knew herself. There was calm there, but also strength. The stillness of someone who understood that serenity could be a weapon sharper than any blade. The world she lived in had long since turned to dust, but her lessons endured in the places where history overlaps with the present, in the quiet corners of every woman's life, where compromise becomes survival, where silence becomes resistance, where dignity must be protected, not by power, but by endurance. She was never meant to be remembered as strong, because her strength did not fit the narrative of her age. It was not loud, not violent, not crowned in tragedy. It was the kind of strength that holds steady under humiliation, that keeps breathing in a room where fear has taken the air, that smiles even when the world misnames you. She had been trained to obey, and yet she learned how to disarm obedience, how to turn submission into strategy. Henry thought he had dismissed her, when in truth she had dismissed him. There is a certain poetry in the way history has begun to return to her. For centuries, she was the ghost at the edge of Tudor stories, present but unheard, her name only mentioned as a cautionary tale or an afterthought. Now she is being rewritten, rediscovered, not as a failure of beauty, but as a master of survival. The revision is not a correction, it is a resurrection. Every new historian who writes her name with reverence restores a piece of what was taken from her. Every reader who sees her portrait and calls it serene instead of plain gives back a small measure of the dignity that 500 years of men had stripped away. Slowly, she is returning to life, not in flesh but in memory. Her story reshaped, not by kings but by understanding. In truth, she never needed rescuing. Even in her own time, she was never powerless. She simply learned to use her power differently. She understood that in a world where men ruled by force, a woman's greatest weapon was her ability to remain unbroken, where others had been too proud to yield. Anne had turned humility into armor. Her compliance was never cowardice. It was calculation. She read the room, saw the sharp edges of Henry's ego, and gave him what he needed most, an illusion of control. In exchange, she took everything that mattered: her freedom, her wealth, her life. And while the women who defied him were buried headless, she grew old in sunlight, surrounded by music and laughter. The truth is not that she escaped him. it is that she outwitted him. There are many kinds of courage, but the most invisible kind is the one that never calls itself brave. Anne's courage lived in the space between breaths, in the stillness that others mistook for passivity. She had the wisdom to see that sometimes survival is not about winning, but about refusing to lose. She knew that not all victories wear crowns. Some are soft, hidden, and silent, like the slow beating of a heart that refuses to stop. Her story is a reminder that history has been wrong about strength for far too long, that it does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. The marble above her grave is worn now, smooth from centuries of footsteps and forgotten prayers. But perhaps that is fitting, because she was never one for grandeur. She belonged not to the fire but to the earth, steady and enduring. The tourists who walk over her name each day do not know that beneath their feet lies the only queen Henry VIII could not destroy. They do not see the invisible crown she forged from patience, the quiet throne she built from understanding. But the abbey knows. The stones remember. They have held her longer than any man ever could, and in their silence, they keep her safe. Imagine her now, if such things can be imagined, walking through the afterlife's endless halls of time. Around her move the spirits of those who once burned bright and fell, Anne Boleyn still fierce and defiant, Catherine Howard still young and trembling, Catherine of Aragon still proud in her faith, Jane Seymour still pale from childbirth. And among them walks Anne of Cleves, calm as moonlight, smiling gently, her hands clasped before her. She carries no bitterness, no envy, only a peace that humbles even the dead. The others ask her, perhaps, how she did it, how she lived when the rest of them did not, and she answers as she always did in life, softly, by understanding the king, Herr Ghost, if ghosts exist, does not haunt the world in anger. It lingers as a kind of blessing for those who learn too late that survival is not shameful. The modern world, with all its noise and mirrors, could use her stillness. We live in a time where people mistake shouting for power, where endurance is forgotten beneath the chaos of ambition. Anne of Cleves would have smiled at that, too. She would have known that no empire, no century, no king, no man can outlast the patience of those who wait. Her victory was not made of glory or love or vengeance. It was made of time. And time, in the end, belongs only to those who know how to endure it. If she could speak across the centuries to those who pass above her tomb, perhaps she would not talk of Henry at all. She would not mention the word ugly, or the cruel disguise that began her downfall, or the marriage that ended in humiliation. She would speak instead of freedom, the kind that does not come from crowns or titles, but from knowing when to walk away. She would remind us that survival is not luck but choice, that peace must be built, not given. That dignity cannot be taken from those who never let the world define it. And then, as softly as she lived, she would vanish again, leaving only the faintest trace of her voice in the air. Remember me not for what I endured, but for how quietly I endured it. The abbey doors close each night, locking away centuries of dust and the silent company of the dead. And yet somewhere, under the steady rhythm of footsteps and time, Anne of Cleves endures still untouched, undiminished, unforgotten. The world has finally learned what she knew all along, that the truest power lies not in being loved, but in surviving unbroken. Her story, once buried beneath a king's lie, has outlasted the crown that cursed her. It is the story of a woman who turned obedience into strategy, shame into strength, and silence into survival. And for that, she will never truly die. And so, at the edge of history's great noise, her name endures like a candle flame that refuses to be blown out. Fragile, yet steady, defying the centuries that tried to erase her. Anne of Cleves belongs to no single time now. She drifts between the past and the present, her story rising again in every generation that rediscovers the power of quiet endurance. The world she left behind its tapestries, Tibonke, its cruel splendor has long dissolved into dust. But the truth she carried has not aged. It speaks to those who have known rejection and humiliation, who have walked away from the places that promised love and instead offered shame, who have learned that survival can be softer than victory, yet infinitely more profound. She lived without vengeance, without spectacle, and that, more than any coronation or conquest, has made her eternal. There is something almost divine in the way her story was reclaimed by time itself, as if the centuries conspired to bring her back from the shadows just when the world had grown wise enough to hear her. In an age that worships noise, Anne's silence feels radical. Her calm becomes courage. Her restraint becomes rebellion. She is no longer the woman who failed to please a king, but the woman who refused to let a king define what pleasure, or power, or worth truly meant. Henry ruled a nation, but Anne ruled herself, and that kind of rule is rarer, too harder, more enduring than any crown of gold. She did not win her freedom by fighting for it. She simply claimed it by existing beyond his reach. The story of Anne of Cleves is also the story of how memory heals itself, how truth, buried for half a millennium, can still find a voice. Every retelling, every portrait restored, every documentary or book or whispered conversation about her is a form of resurrection. She no longer stands in the shadow of Henry VIII, but in her own light, soft yet unwavering, a beacon for those who understand that gentleness is not weakness. She teaches that you can be dismissed, insulted, and forgotten, and still leave a mark that outlives empires. The power she held was invisible, but it was the kind that changes everything quietly, like water carving through stone, slow but unstoppable. In that sense, her life feels like a prophecy that outlasted its age. She had lived in a world built on fear and spectacle, and she responded with grace so complete that even cruelty could not stain it. Perhaps she knew, even then, that her worth could not be measured by the man who failed to see it. There must have been nights when she sat by the window in her palace, looking out at the flickering lights along the Thames, and realized that the peace she felt was something her husband, her former king, would never know. He had conquered kingdoms and broken churches, but he could not conquer himself. And she, the woman he had called ugly, had mastered the one thing he could not: stillness. That stillness remains her legacy. It has outlived every insult, every distortion, every careless historian who repeated Henry's lie without question. It has outlived the empire that mocked her, outlived the religion that divided her, outlived even the idea that beauty must always be visible. The longer one studies her story, the clearer it becomes that Anne of Cleves was not a mistake in the narrative of Henry's reign. She was its correction. She was the balance to his chaos, the answer to his tyranny, the lesson that even absolute power can be outmaneuvered by quiet intelligence. While others rose and fell, like waves in a tempest, she became the tide itself, steady, endless, unbroken. There is a strange comfort in imagining her beyond time, walking through a vast field of stillness, untouched by the noise of kings. Perhaps she hums softly to herself, a hymn remembered from her childhood in Cleves. Her voice carried on a wind that smells of the Rhine and distant rain. Around here, there is no crown, no scepter, no audience. She no longer needs them. Her life was never meant for spectacle. It was meant to remind the world that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to refuse to become a tragedy. In that refusal lies the quiet revolution of her soul, and maybe that is why, even now, she feels strangely alive to those who stumble upon her story. When we read about her, we do not mourn her, we learn from her. We do not pity her, we recognize ourselves in her. She represents the victory of endurance over ego, of grace over cruelty, of time over tyranny. She is proof that history does not belong solely to those who roar, but to those who endure long enough to outlast the roar. Her spirit has become the soft heartbeat beneath the din of centuries, reminding us that peace can be the fiercest form of power. If Henry's legacy was one of fire and destruction, Anne's is one of water and patience, clear, steady, cleansing. He burned through his life like a storm, devouring everything it touched, while she flowed quietly around obstacles, reshaping her fate without ever appearing to fight it. In the end, it was her way, not his, that endured. The kingdom he ruled would fracture and fade, but her story, once forgotten, would return stronger with every century that sought to understand her. She has become the patron saint of survivors, of those who choose grace in the face of humiliation, of those who bow without breaking and rise without boasting. Now, when her portrait hangs in galleries, visitors linger longer than they used to. They no longer search her face for proof of Henry's insult. They search for themselves. They find in her expression not plainness but peace, not weakness but composure, not tragedy but triumph. Her eyes, painted centuries ago, seem to look back through time with the same patient knowing that defined her life, as if to say, I was never what he said I was, and neither are you. It is the gaze of a woman who has already forgiven the world for misunderstanding her, and perhaps that is her final gift, the forgiveness that lingers after everything else fades. She forgave the man who humiliated her, the courtiers who mocked her, the chroniclers who erased her. In that forgiveness lies her immortality. It is not a saintly, passive kind of pardon, but a deeper understanding that resentment chains us to the past, while mercy frees us to live. She lived unchained, and that is why her story still breathes. As night falls over London and the abbey bells toll softly across the city, her name hums beneath the sound. Fin but unending. Anne of Cleves, queen for half a year, sister for a lifetime, survivor forever. The woman who was once dismissed as plain has become a mirror through which history sees its own blindness, and when all the grand stories of kings and wars and crowns are finally forgotten, hers will remain, shining quietly in the dark, reminding us that there is no greater beauty, no greater strength, and no greater victory than to live in peace, unbroken, when the world expected you not to survive at all.